Welcome to the TechLink Health Podcast, an on-demand source for the top trending healthcare topics and insights. Delivered by key opinion and emerging leaders and as featured on the TechLink Health app. The healthcare industry is rapidly evolving, so our goal is to connect listeners to the most relevant insights, ranging from digital health to financial well-being to interesting side gigs. For more details, visit www.techlink.health.
Hi everyone, I'm Govind Shantharam, and I'll be co-hosting this episode with Dr. Rodney Suman. This episode focuses on digital technologies and addresses the ways in which such technologies can be leveraged, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic. Today's guest is Sumanth Swaminathan, founder and CEO of Vironix Health. To give you some background, Sumanth did his undergrad at the University of Delaware in chemical engineering, followed by a PhD in applied mathematics at Northwestern University. He then did 2 postdoc fellowships, the first at Northwestern and the second at the University of Oxford. Next, Sumanth became the chief data scientist at Revon Systems, followed by an assignment as the CEO of Iterex Therapeutics. Ultimately, Sumanth founded Vironix Health, which is a machine learning and software company that has developed the CovidX platform, a personalized remote monitoring and triage software that's meant to assist healthcare institutions, employers, schools, and a variety of other global entities with reopening following the surge of the COVID-19 pandemic. So, without further delay, please welcome Sumanth Swaminathan. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Govind, and thanks to TechLink for having me here.
Before we jump in, my understanding is that you are a professional classical Indian saxophone player. How'd you get into such a thing?
Yeah, that's a passion that goes back really to my childhood. So I've been a performer for a few decades now. I was lucky enough to meet a very famous musician who pioneered Indian classical saxophone in the late 70s. So I met him when I was young. I studied with him in India, and it's a small but really robust community of Carnatic saxophone players out there. I continue to teach, perform, and it keeps me alive and enthusiastic when I'm not working on technology.
That's absolutely fantastic. I love hearing about how people can wear the arts and the hard sciences and mathematics at a very high level. In any case, let's jump into the meat of today. We'll be talking about digital technologies and smart technology, but maybe we can roll back just for a second for the layperson and for those in the medical community who don't work in the artificial intelligence and machine learning space. What's the difference between AI and ML? They're often interchangeably used, but as an expert in the field, can you take a second to explain the nuance in these terms?
Loosely, I would think of AI as a bigger topic and machine learning as a specific topic. Broadly speaking, artificial intelligence just refers to an attempt to make a machine or something non-animate intelligent. It can do that through machine learning methods. It can do it through other things. So, for example, you could even consider a robot that's been built to sense somebody raising their hand in a classroom as a form of artificial intelligence. And that robot may not be learning from any evidence. It may have a set of complicated rules predetermined, programmed into that robot, sort of layered on with some other interesting biological sensors that see that somebody has raised their hand. Whereas in general, when we talk about machine learning, we talk about machines learning from evidence, either actively or passively learning from evidence. And so people use these terms interchangeably because sometimes they're confusing and it's sort of a point of view, right? Whether you call an ML exercise artificial intelligence. I would consider AI to be a broader idea of just enabling a machine to behave intelligently. And it could be doing that through deterministic rules, through machine learning, through sensors, through some combination of these things. In the same way that your own brain processes ideas through a complicated mix of things. You invoke facts, like that the capital of Pennsylvania is Harrisburg. That is fact that doesn't require any reasoning. It's just memory. But you also have abstract reasoning, you have logical reasoning, you have inductive reasoning. When you combine all these things together, you get an intelligent human being. So AI loosely attempts to make machines that are, quote, smart. And machine learning really focuses on learning from evidence, either in a supervised or unsupervised way. And that's a complicated topic.
Yeah, but I think early on you were able to recognize that there is a role for machine learning in the healthcare space specifically. And we'll get into what you're doing at Vironix. But before we do that, can you maybe talk about how you see AI and machine learning developing and what role it's been able to carve out specifically within the pandemic? A lot of things have changed over the last 6 months in healthcare, primarily because of the pandemic. What role do you see smart technologies playing in managing this global pandemic?
Yeah, it's the biggest role I've seen in my lifetime, predominantly because people, rightfully so, whether they be healthcare practitioners or people on the street, are worried about infection. We have other physicians on this panel too who can speak to some of what I'm going to say. But absent a vaccine, what a healthcare professional, the majority of the time will of course treat your symptoms. And what you'd like to do is catch the signs of infection early, potential flare-ups early, so that you can remotely manage people and not expose the rest of the world to infection. And hopefully they'd have better outcomes because you've caught symptoms of shortness of breath or fever where you can treat it with over-the-counter medications and start hydrating early, eating better early, separating yourself from other people. And probably the long-term outcome of that path of this remote management, remote detection is better than somebody who doesn't catch these things early, maybe ends up on a mechanical ventilator in the hospital. And so what AI and machine learning softwares are doing is that they are catching this information early remotely, either via sensors or through patient-reported information through apps. They're interpreting this, and that interpretation is extremely important. Because, for example, somebody could be having a headache just because they're dehydrated. Mm-hmm. Somebody could have an escalation in their heart rate that a sensor picked up just because they happen to be walking up the stairs, or they're a COPD patient that gets chronically short of breath. And all those things that happened mean something different for, let's say, a patient who's a heart failure patient as opposed to somebody who has no comorbid conditions at all. What you want to do is you want to interpret all of this information fast and early. And interpreting that information is very difficult. That's where machine learning has an important role to play. Trying to get at this stuff from sort of classic first principles or figuring out exactly how things work is extremely difficult. Particularly in this pandemic, I think it's enabled opportunities for remote care, remote detection, early detection. And that has a role to play in preventing infection, stopping death, stopping disease spread, et cetera.
That's very interesting. This is Dr. Sumanth. I'd like to take a step back and maybe hear a little bit about how you started the company and where, before the pandemic, we were headed with this technology, and dig a little deeper in the technology and give us some examples.
Sure. I've been in the digital health space for about now 6 years, primarily involved in making triage tools for chronic lung and heart disease. So what we were trying to do, particularly for COPD and asthma patients, is we were trying to give them some tools at home that are really easy to use. Because we know adoption of technology is such a problem. Some tools that are really easy to use, don't require much effort, where we could take data that's available at home every day. So not blood biomarker data or protein data that sits in databases that's sort of difficult to access, but something that a patient would know the answer to, or your watch or a simple device at home could give you the answer to, like your heart rate or 2 set. So we were trying to take that information and try to predict when somebody was going to have a clinically significant flare-up early. Mm-hmm. So why were we interested? Because we know that unnecessary exacerbations of COPD are drivers of billions and billions in spending in the US alone per year, and drivers of very serious mortality. Asthma, of course, probably a bit more than COPD, it sort of sits in a space where there's been a lot of new controller medications to try to keep flare-ups under control. But unchecked exacerbations of asthma, of course, are also drivers of major healthcare spending. Mm-hmm. And we know that the vast majority of spending in the healthcare system is for chronic illness. And so we were trying to get to a place where we could offer people technology that would catch these things and improve the course of their care. We were able to show that a mix of early detection via some of these algorithms, plus just general awareness of your health, right? Seeing your trends in O2 saturation over time, or just seeing what your baseline temperature actually is, knowing these things. We've shown in tests and clinical studies that, people get improvements in symptom control with very little use of such apps as our apps, reduction in anxiety, reduction in depression, improvement in taking of their existing medications. Mm-hmm. And so it's what we call early detection and decision support. Catch this thing early, anytime there's evidence of some sort of health deterioration, give the right guidance early, and then provide a suite of simple to access tools for long-term management. You get those 3 things right, you can use these kinds of AI technologies to improve health, reduce massive amounts of unnecessary spending in the healthcare system.
And this data is going to clinicians, or how does that exactly work?
Yeah. So in general, we're what the FDA calls patient decision support. So
Mhm.
the information is available to the user. And then, of course, it's shareable with a clinician or an institution, et cetera, et cetera.
I see.
The primary idea is for this to interact with the consumer. So for them to get the decision support they need. And then, of course, there is clinical decision support embedded in this as well for physicians, but all of this is sort of patient consented sharing of data, et cetera, et cetera. And so clinicians can use this.
And so what started off as pre-pandemic COPD, asthma, chronic lung, chronic heart disease management, it's now flipped into post-COVID tools. Can you maybe talk to us about what you've now developed and what the underlying software of Vironix is?
Yeah, it's a great question. Once COVID hit, there was obviously an early period of disease spread and evaluation and testing and trying to understand, right, how fast does this thing spread? How lethal is it? What kinds of people get it? And so a lot of clinical characteristic data came out across the world. Most of it came from China early, and then it started coming from Western Europe, the United States, New York, Seattle, places like this. That's describing essentially what people who are diagnosed with the illness, what kind of characteristics they have. We've talked about whether young people are susceptible to this or not, right? So age is a clinical characteristic. It's a profile characteristic that can predict whether somebody's going to have the disease. So is people who have other comorbid conditions, diabetes, high blood pressure, are more prone to have worse outcomes. So we combined clinical characteristic data from the literature all over the world to sort of prepare initial, what we call stacked classifiers that diagnose when somebody is going to have a severe or non-severe presentation of COVID and actually other related viral respiratory illnesses. We built this new technology over the last 6 months. What that technology is designed to do is to take some of those characteristics I told you about: age, height, weight, the symptoms that you're experiencing at any given time, what other diagnoses you're having, and it essentially risk stratifies you for either having the illness, and if you have the illness, how severe it is. Why did we build this software? Because for the earlier point I mentioned, if we can do this, we can try to get people to stay at home and address their problem sooner rather than go to an institution and healthcare institution, maybe infect a doctor or get the same treatment they would get at home. Number two, to get people who are risky to the doctor sooner if they need some sort of care. But number three, and this is really why we built our enterprise software, our product, is that the world is shut down right now, still to a large extent. And that's a completely unsustainable condition for any ecosystem. And when you have economic and social shutdown happening at the same time, social separation, social containment, people, what you're going to see is a lot of awful problems continue to creep up. You'll see unemployment spike. You'll see, this is already happening in major cities, by the way. You'll see rental and real estate prices spike. You'll see economic depression ensue. People will lose their health care. Depression creeps up. Social violence creeps up. These are the kinds of things that you can't subject an ecosystem to forever. So we want to get people back to work. And in getting people back to work or back to school, students back to school, you need to have some controls and checks in place. Most of the major regulatory agencies in the country on a local, state, and federal level have called for some sort of symptom monitoring or vital sign checks, either remotely or in the workplace or at schools, to try to give some sort of assurance that people aren't infected. The CDC's put out guidelines, the OSHA's put out guidelines, you'll see local, state. New York City has a ton of guidelines in themselves. The idea is to get things back to normal, but do it safely. And then whatever you're trying to do to reduce the infection of spread, it should be as non-invasive as possible. And it should respect the dignity of people. There are things that people are trying, which I personally don't believe are very effective. And then there's some other solutions that are better. But this is a great application for interpretive algorithms like Vironix's at home.
So you're saying you can predict if someone is potentially infected or just at high risk, like a risk score, as you said, or both?
Yeah, we can do risk stratification and then also early decision support at home. So ideally, you'd catch somebody who's displaying all the evidence of an infectious individual before they get out of the house, before they get on that bus, before they show up at an institution where somebody's pointing a thermometer at their head, and they've already potentially infected everybody in line.
Is that based on the fact that they're coughing, they have a fever?
So it's a complicated mix of all those things. So it's if they're presenting symptoms, that's one of it, but we're also following their vital signs over time. For example, our software is actually configured to detect asymptomatic silent hypoxia if people are having a downtrend in their oxygen saturation consistently.
That's very cool.
Right? It's also rigged to interpret the severity of, let's say, what you said, a cough and a shortness of breath based on age. So we obviously know that people over the age of 65, maybe over the age of 60, depending on which data set you look at, are much more prone to bad outcomes. This is interpreting gender, age, baseline health characteristics and lung function, symptoms, alternate diagnoses. It's doing it all. And it takes a few seconds in the morning. It's not some burdensome process. You enroll in the software, you do your check in the morning, and then a really important part of this, I don't want to underemphasize this, is that we've rigged the software so that an employer can then know if somebody has completed their monitoring and if they've gotten an indication to work from home or somewhere else without sharing the health data of the individual with the employer.
Anonymized.
Right? Because our algorithms are interpreting the health data. And so you're not violating HIPAA. You don't have someone at an employer site taking some symptom checklist. Right? I mean, suppose you show up at a site, somebody points a thermometer at you. First of all, we know from the clinical data sets that, in fact, a majority of the people who have the infection, you can look at the Wuhan data set from New England Journal of Medicine. There was Lancet articles that were produced out of Western Europe. I mean, across the board, if you look at these data sets, the majority of people, a significant majority of people, didn't even present with a fever when they were diagnosed. So temperature checks, they don't really work. Like even if and if somebody doesn't have a fever, even if they did, right, the thermometer also has to work. Whatever the non-contact thermometer has to work if they're pointing at you. But if somebody takes it on your symptoms,
what you're talking about. The fact is that a lot of people aren't familiar with this term, which I'm sure you are. The happy hypoxics, or have you heard such a term? It's sort of being floated out there amongst intensivists. And the idea is these patients don't even know they're hypoxic. They could be sitting in the 80s, which is very low, and not even realize it. And
yes, I've heard the term. Yeah.
And also with that hypoxia, you're going to get some reflex tachycardia associated with it. So that's very interesting. And certainly your technology could definitely be used with heart failure exacerbations. I'm a cardiologist, so that rings along that line. That makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, I mean, look, for the purpose of remote monitoring studies, sort of collect granular information on vital signs at home, and to actually discern the natural history that leads up to either a diagnosis or to a flare-up. These kinds of things are very difficult to do if you're not collecting temporal data in a more careful way. And so you can learn all kinds of things about the onset of illness, the severity of illness, the windows of opportunity to intervene simply by remote monitoring of the right set of signs and symptoms sort of in a frequent way. And of course, because we're a company that does clinical evaluation and testing of our technologies, we've done some of these studies and we have some of this natural history data on a variety of illnesses.
I had one more question about the hardware involved, and I think that's the challenge. Is there hardware, or is this off the phone?
Yeah, it's a good question. It would depend on the application and sort of the accuracy that you need. So if you wanted to do like a very good clinical study, there's some amazing continuous monitoring devices. For example, a company called Bodymetrics makes this great ring that samples your oxygen saturation and heart rate every second, and it's quite accurate. So if you're trying to discern a health outcome that requires like that level of data every second, you can get one of those, and they're on the higher end side. And then if you don't need something sampled that often, you can use something as simple, right, as a retail clip-on pulse oximeter. Sometimes the hardware that you want to use depends on your need. But one thing, particularly for commercial use of our product, is that if you compare the cost of some of the simple oximeters and contactless thermometers that you might want to use in tandem with our software right at home, the overall cost of licensing our software plus buying those devices for every single person in your organization would cost a good bit less. So they could use our software for a year and buy all these devices, and it would cost less than it would cost to test everybody in the organization once. Making this economical is important. The hardware component, for the purpose, depends on what you're trying to learn, but can be either very high end for careful research studies, or it can be, I think, very reasonable for consumer use.
I think the underlying technology sounds absolutely fantastic, and the sort of calculation of risk and reward that you're doing is also very interesting as you bring it to a very complicated ecosystem, whether that's a financial risk or the reward of having better patient outcomes. Are you running into any difficulties when communicating to institutions, schools, employers, whoever it is, about this balancing act between health and safety of the people while trying to reopen economies and get the workforce back into motion? How are you striking that balance, and where's the technology kind of answering that question potentially?
Yeah, that is a tremendously good question. So there's a couple of ways to answer this. Number one, there's a lot of confusion and uncertainty about what to do. That's by far and away the biggest challenge. Institutions, schools are looking for some clear guidance from a regulatory agency that says, do exactly this. Or they're looking for guidance from their peers who've adopted something that's consistent with some sort of guideline. In the absence of that, they're not exactly sure what to do. So part of this is navigating the uncertainty and the apprehension of some policy and decision makers in organizations who don't feel like they have clear guidance on what they're required to do. Now, the larger question you asked has been a difficult question in the healthcare system for a long time. If you were to use our product, we can show you from data that we've collected that you get this reduction in anxiety, this reduction in depression. You'd have improved healthcare outcomes for asthmatics. A lot of bigger corporations, right, they actually pay the healthcare costs. These kinds of technologies will address the underlying outcomes of your members. They'll improve your costs.
But to tackle some of those challenges, you need to build a good team around you. Can you talk a little bit about how you've been able to bring on data scientists, clinicians, lawyers, executives? In fact, TechLink Health aims to facilitate such connections to allow startups to more easily advance. How do you go about building such a team?
Yeah, it's been through the traditional difficult way, which I think is where TechLink Health can really bring a lot of value to startups and even larger organizations. When you're proceeding through to get products into the marketplace, there's all kinds of things that are in play outside of the technology. You might need to go to the FDA. When you're talking to customers, you may need to show that certain types of specialists have tested your technology and they approve of it. And you may need them to communicate to the specialists on the other side. When you're developing your algorithms, you may need physician and specialist input up front. Advisors, clinical specialists, for digital health, these are extremely important players. The way we've done it in the past has been primarily the way lots of organizations do things, which is we have our own existing network of connections. We try to look to people that we know. So, for example, most of our healthcare advisors, I've met some of these folks at conferences. They liked our scientific presentations, conversations, and then we ended up working with them. Once they worked with us, we went to their friends, and those advisors came on board. Key opinion leader panels came to sales calls. Key opinion panels had physicians on them. I spoke to them. We had a nice discussion. They ended up being advisors for us. Organic interactions, network connections, putting yourself out there, you find these folks. But the truth is, the timeline for doing all that stuff is uncertain. And you might have immediate needs. You might have short or long-term needs where it would be nice to have a place to go to where you know there's a lot of medical expertise there. The FDA, for example, it's not easy to interact on their timeline. Maybe they tell me today, after submitting something like a month back, that they want to get on a call in a week. I've got a week to find somebody, right, who could potentially communicate what the FDA wants. Just like many other things, in the medical side, we have leveraged our networks. Whereas in other cases, for example, there are one-stop shops. We just brought on board a development team for doing some of our software development. So they have a bunch of experts for doing front and back end development with different mobile and web app technologies. We knew they were there, and we're getting the targeted expertise that we need. I can assure you, if we knew that there was something out there where I might need the opinion of an ID doctor today and then a cardiologist tomorrow, and I need something credentialed, immediate, or even long-term, if these things were available to us, we almost certainly would have pursued those.
Those are all great points. Well, Sumanth, this has been an absolutely amazing conversation, and Rodney and I have both learned a ton. Before we wrap up, what final takeaway or insight do you have for those in the healthcare space? And two, where can people find you and the great work you're doing at Vironix?
Thanks, Govind. Thanks, Rodney, Anthony. Thanks, everybody, obviously, for having me here. So last point, I would just say that technology is going to be advancing. It's already advancing at quite a level, and I think it's going to have a part to play in the healthcare space. So I think the healthcare community in itself hopefully will adopt some of these technologies and look at them, try to help them to improve their own practice and give them also opportunities to work on more difficult problems. There's no shortage of problems to solve in healthcare in the United States. So it's still an area where there's a lot of work to be done. So it's a good space to be in. Where can you find us? You can go to Vironix.ai. That's Vironix.ai to take a look at our company and its profile. And if you'd like to try our product, the CovidX software, you can go to demo.vironix.ai and enroll a profile there. And you can play with our software for free of charge and see if it's the right fit for your organization or your school or your community, your church, your law firm, whatever you'd like.
Awesome. Well, Sumanth, it's been an absolute pleasure. I know you're busy, so we will wrap up the episode there. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everyone. Pleasure to talk to you as well.
Thanks for listening to this episode. TechLink Health is a healthcare advisory platform for consumers and organizations to stay informed with the latest insights while connecting with healthcare experts for telehealth, e-consults, and consulting services. For more details, visit www.techlink.health.